Bloomberg Politics presents Election Day 2015 in the United Kingdom. Cameron, Miliband, Charlotte, Clegg. Who will be the next Prime Minister? Or who will be the leader of the party with the most seats in Parliament to form a coalition government at the request of the Queen to persuade one or more other parties to agree on a platform that can command a majority in the House of Commons? It all starts now on With All Due Respect. Across the pond, above and beyond.
Happy Overseas Election Day, sports fans. To make our British viewers feel comfortable, we're doing the show in English tonight. We've got Iowa, Chris Christie and Carly Fiorina. But first, the polls just closed across the pond in the land that some know as Blighty. So without wasting any time, let's go to London, where Francine Lacqua will give us a super quick update on the British election. Francine, the polls just closed. What do we know?
All right, John, so we just had the exit polls. Now, they've been accurate for the last two times, and we have the Tories possibly with 316 seats. Now, if this were to be true, it means that they may be able to actually form a minority government. Look, this is a very uncertain election, but if these figures are true with the exit poll, we may be onto something, and we may get a parliament a little bit quicker than a lot of people are expecting.
Wow, amazing. Okay, a little surprise there. Many thanks, Francine Lacqua. Don't take off your mic because we're going to be coming back to you for a more thorough download later.
All right, we're here in Des Moines, Iowa. Behind me is Mission Control of our partners at the Des Moines Register, who we're covering the caucus process with all the way through the caucuses early next year. That's where the whole thing gets made. Carly Fiorina, newly minted presidential candidate, has been spending part of her day here. She attended one of those famous Des Moines Register editorial boards, and we'll have more on that and time with her later.
Let me add an FYI. The Iowa Republican Party says it's cutting a lot of charges to campaigns for its presidential straw poll. It'll be less of a fundraiser and more of a festival of democracy. Mark, this is a big deal, the Iowa straw poll, and it's had some issues and some problems in the past couple cycles. Who wins and who loses with this straw poll change? We've lost. Mark Halperin apparently gone, lost. Let's go back. We've lost Mark Halperin's connection from Iowa, so I'm going to go back to Francine Lacqua. I'm hoping Francine is still there in London. Francine, are you there?
I am. I'm here.
Let's talk about those exit polls. Tell us what you're seeing. I know they've only been in your hands for a few minutes, but give us some details there.
Look, John, the exit polls are important. One caveat, because we have been speaking to a lot of pollsters. So these are in, the margin of error is still about 2 to 3 percentage points. And in terms of seats, that means that it could be 10 seats off. In terms of what we know so far, it seems that the Conservatives have 316 seats. Now, this, again, is an exit poll, so it doesn't mean it's completely right. The other problem is that because you have so many more smaller parties, when you speak to pollsters, they say this is probably the most uncertain exit poll because it's that much more difficult to exactly see what people are thinking. But this means that they spoke to people that have voted. If the Conservatives indeed have 316 seats, it means that with the Lib Dems, who have 10 seats, so significantly far from 2010, they would still be able to form a government. So if we have another coalition government, like what we've had in the last five years. Look, these exit polls, John, maybe it's a little bit less uncertain than we've been talking about for the last couple of weeks, because the predictions had both main parties at 270. If one is at, above 310, this feels like possibly, and there's a lot of caveats, but it feels like possibly the Conservatives could form a coalition.
Right. Francine, I'd say by all standards, that's kind of a surprise. Almost everybody over the course of the past few days has been assuming that we would have a hung election. What accounts for, if it's true, what the exit polls show, and the Conservative Party's done as well as it's done, what accounts for that in the closing days of the election, do you think?
Done. Yeah, so you're absolutely right. The polls really had them neck and neck. However, the spread bettors and the betting shops over the last couple of days were saying that actually the Conservatives may do better than expected for two reasons. First of all, a lot of voters were actually undecided until last week. The last poll said 40% of voters thought that they weren't really sure of who they vote for. So when it comes to the ballot box, where you're in that little cubicle, a lot of people said that they may just vote for, the head of the coalition that gave them stability over the last 5 years. It may be also tactical voting. Remember, the big concern, if you're going to vote Labour for a lot of the Brits here, is that they may be looking at an alliance with the Scottish National Party. Now, having the Scottish National Party at Westminster to a lot of English is a concern. So that may actually explain these exit polls.
How soon will we know actual results? I know it's nighttime there, but how soon will we get to hear what's actually happened as opposed to just relying on the exit polls?
So we just heard in the last couple of minutes that we will hear from the first proper seat, maybe in 40 minutes. That's a record time. I've never seen anything like it. And then we should have a much better idea in about 3 to 4 hours. I would say, 5 a.m. our time, so 7 hours from now, we should have a very clear idea, if not an absolute idea, of the number of seats won by every party.
Francine, thank you. These British elections have got us all backward. We did our guest first, and we're saving our domestic talk for after the break. Straw polls, George W. Bush and Tom Brady when we come back. Just like the 2013 Super Bowl power outage, we had a small technical snafu at the top of our show, so we're going to do a classic restart. Let's pick up in Iowa, where the state Republican Party says that it's cutting a lot of charges to campaigns for its presidential straw poll. It'll be less of a fundraiser and more of a festival of democracy. Mark, my question to you is who wins and who loses with this big straw poll change?
It's good for the Republican Party here. It's good for the caucuses in general and Iowa's status. And I think it's good for candidates like Rand Paul, Mike Huckabee, and Rick Santorum, who now, if they do well in the straw poll, they'll get a lot of credit for it, because I think it's going to be very hard for any candidate to say now they're not going to participate when they've taken away some of the things that people criticize and would allowed some candidates in the past to say they weren't going to be part of the straw poll. They've all got to come now. Yeah, well, I think it's also true that the campaigns that don't have a lot of money, this has become a very expensive proposition, not just the fees that you had to pay to take part, but the food and all the organization. It had become something you had to drop a lot of dough on. If you're a campaign without much money, you now have a chance to win here. Here's who it's bad for. It's bad for all the national reporters who were, annoyed with the straw poll and talked it down. I almost used profanity. This is good for those of us who think the straw poll is awesome. All right. Because it means it stays alive. Okay. Well, we're on the topic of Republican politics. Let's think about John Ellis Bush. The Washington Post reports that Jeb told an exclusive group in Manhattan this week that his most influential advisor on U.S.-Israel policy is his brother, the former president, George W. Bush. Mark, given the scorn that's widely heaped on W's foreign policy, especially on the Mideast, is Jeb being brave or suicidal by saying that he takes advice from 43? I think he's doing something that I didn't think he'd do very much of. I think he was pandering in the room, knowing that the people in that room in New York City thought his brother was good on foreign policy on Israel and that President Obama isn't. And he didn't think through that when it leaked out, it would hit him right in his weakest spot. He has to get rid of the narrative that he is the son and the brother. And anytime he does this, I think it's unnecessary, and I think it was a moment of weakness and thoughtlessness. Well, I want to say it's possible that this is one of these false binaries between brave and suicidal. He could be being quite brave and just actually telling the truth. While at the same time, I do think it's suicidal, because the last thing in the world that he needs is further association with his brother. And we know that the Bush name is a huge drag on his candidacy. And when it comes to foreign policy, that is not a name, 43W, George W. Bush, so not a name you want to have on your resume. I'm not against him telling the truth, but I bet he could have come up with somebody else who advises him on Israel who would have played well in the room. Well, and when it leaked out, would not have been as big a problem. Every day he's known as the son and the brother. I think it's a bad day for him, and his own advisors agree that's their biggest problem. I wonder whether he was a little bit scarred by having James Addison Baker
get in trouble for his views on Israel. You don't want to say James Baker, so you go in the opposite direction and say George W. Bush. Not a super bright thing to do, I don't think. All right, let's move on here. Chris Christie made his first trip to New Hampshire today since last week's Bridgegate indictments. He did not seem embattled at all. In fact, his staunchest defense was not of himself, but of one of New England's favorite sons, Tom Brady.
I think the media and others love for somebody who's married to a beautiful model, who's richer than you can imagine, and who's a future Hall of Famer, to take a couple of shots at him. People like that every once in a while. I think it's way overblown.
What do you think about that, Mark? Good move, bad move?
Anytime you can defend Tom Brady in New England is a good move, regardless of the facts, if you're a politician trying to win the votes of New Englanders. So awesome move. Hard
to argue with that. Certainly a smarter move than wearing that orange sweater and going down to Dallas. All right, so coming up, we have Carly Fiorina in Iowa with Mark Halperin in the Des Moines Register. Nothing is off the table.
Here in Des Moines, Iowa, we spent the day with our partners at the Des Moines Register, and they had a special guest in for one of their famous editorial boards, presidential candidate Carly Fiorina. It was a long ed board, normal, lots of issues discussed. Want to show you a few highlights. First, on the issue that comes up all the time with journalists, Carly Fiorina was asked about the circumstances of her departure from Hewlett-Packard.
I was fired in a boardroom brawl that played out over 2 weeks. We had a couple board members who took it upon themselves to leak confidential boardroom conversations into the press. That was conduct unbecoming a board member, and you can't tolerate it. And I said, look, it's either you or it's me. It turned out to be me. And what I learned is that when you lead, when you challenge the status quo, you are going to make enemies. It is the nature of leadership. Politics exists in boardrooms as well.
I wanted to call you first. Another topic that came up in the ed board, one that we don't hear about as often, is the question of airline deregulation. Carly Fiorina talked about the fact that some consumers aren't particularly happy with the way airlines treat them.
Do we think we have more choices now as a result of airline deregulation? I think we do. I think we do.
And joining us now on her first trip as an official presidential candidate to Iowa, Carly Fiorina, and with me for the conversation, my colleague from the Des Moines Register, Kathy Abradovich. Surprise to me and other people, even who followed your career closely in politics and business, that you're running for president. Came a little bit out of the blue. What was the moment? Just tell the narrative of the moment where you decided you were going to run. How did that happen?
Well, it wasn't really a moment, actually. It was a process. I would say early last year, while I was engaged in helping other people win in 2014, people started to come up to me that I respected in the party, or voters, and say, Carly, you really need to run.
I want to annotate a little bit here as we go, just for the history. Had you ever thought before that moment you'd ever run for president?
Not really.
Not really. So people started to come up to you and recommend it.
Yeah.
And did you take it instantly? Did you say that's not a bad idea, or did it take some getting used to?
No, I had to really consider that for quite a while, and I did for a long time. And in fact, I a bit put the decision aside until the 2014 elections were over, because I was very busy with our Unlocking Potential project. We built a ground game among women in key states, including Iowa, to bring them to the polls and to bring them to vote for conservatives. But when that election was over, I said, all right, now I have to really think about this seriously.
What was your first reaction, though? Was it, you've got to be crazy? Or was it, you know,
well, I was taken aback. I mean, the very first time it happened was at CPAC. I do.
Who said it to you?
Well, that was a private conversation between him and I. But that'll be his story to tell someday if he wants.
Was the first time ever in your life anyone had said to you should run for president?
And he is a very serious person and a serious colleague and a serious observer. And he walked up to me and said, I want to talk to you about this. I want you to consider doing this. And so I was quite taken aback, I must say. And we had a conversation about why he thought that. And then I kept hearing it and kept hearing it and kept hearing it. And so after the November elections, then I began a serious effort of, okay, well, what would this look like? You know, we'd have to have teams, and we'd have to have support, and we'd have to be able to raise money. And so it's been a process of determining whether or not we can build those things, and I determined we could.
I want to move on to other things, but just to button up the history here, I know you said it was a process and took over time, but there must have been a moment when you said to your husband, let's do this, or I want to do this. Do you remember that moment?
Well, I do remember sitting in our bedroom and having a conversation with Frank. You know, look, you're not a candidate till you actually take the plunge. But I remember having a conversation with Frank after the Christmas holidays. And it was pretty clear in that conversation that we both understood that the probabilities were better than not that we were going to do this.
Did you have to convince him? Was he on board for the
No, I didn't have to convince him. I think Frank has really unshakable faith in me, and for which I'm very grateful and very blessed. But of course, it's a family decision. You know, this is something that impacts his life, our daughter's life, our granddaughter's lives, and so it was a family decision. And then from that moment in the bedroom, we went and began a conversation with our family.
Like most great things in life, it happened in the bedroom. Go
ahead. Oh, good for you.
You've talked a lot about how you rose in your career from being a temp person all the way up to being CEO of large Fortune 500 company. Do you ever, though, have to actually live on your paycheck as a temp person?
Oh yes, absolutely.
You did. So you didn't have a spouse at that time or anything like that. You could.
No, no. I had to live on my paycheck.
And how much did you make?
Oh, I don't even remember, but I do remember this. I remember at the end of every week, I would have maybe 5 cents in the checking account. I remember needing to rent an apartment and the landlord asking me, well, how much money is in your checking account? And I wrote down $50 because that was true.
What were some of the...
So I have lived paycheck to paycheck.
What were some of the
ma'am.
trade-offs you make at that point in your life in terms of things you couldn't afford that you wanted?
Well, you make trade-offs. I made trade-offs about... could I afford a car? The answer was no, I didn't have one. So I walked to the bus stop and took a bus. I made decisions about whether or not I could get a new pair of shoes. You know, I love shoes. I always have, ever since I was a little girl. And sometimes you'd splurge, but more often than not, you wouldn't. You make decisions about whether or not you can go out to dinner or whether you have to do macaroni and cheese. Do you pack your lunch at work? I mean, all those things are decisions that you make every day.
And what kind of car do you drive now?
Well, today I drive a Hyundai, actually.
Okay, so not going for the high-end luxury vehicle?
Well, it's a Hyundai.
To talk about, gets a lot of scrutiny, your career at Hewlett-Packard, and one thing that's come up quite a bit is the layoffs, the pretty extensive layoffs that you made, not from a business point of view, but from a personal human point of view. How much were you involved in making sure that people who were laid off were helped?
Yeah. Well, yes, I managed through the post-9/11 technology recession, and every technology company was having to really button up. I was very closely involved, and in fact, because it's the worst decision a chief executive can make. It's a terrible decision. And so first, I must say, we tried everything but layoffs. I mean, we went through, let's take pay cuts, let's everybody take pay cuts, let's give up bonuses. We went through all that, and yet in some cases it still wasn't enough. So I made very sure, personally sure. I interviewed, for example, the company that would counsel our employees, counsel them on how to go from where they were to their next job. I made very sure that the benefits that we provided to employees were leading edge in the industry, and they were. And I also made very sure that I came out and talked to our employees. Nobody else. I can remember going to a location the day we made an announcement that layoffs were necessary. I went and explained to people why this was necessary. And it was hard on everyone, most especially those who had lost their jobs.
So talk us through the numbers, because numbers get thrown out about how many people actually lost their job in your tenure. 30,000 is the number that gets thrown out most often. But you've said that there was a net increase in employment. So walk us through, how many people were employed at HP in the United States when you started, and how many were employed at HP in the United States when you left?
So the interesting thing to me about this line of questioning, which is totally legitimate, obviously, obviously, but it's all in public record. This is the thing about public companies that is different than politicians. We tracked in every quarterly report our employment in the United States and our employment overseas, quarter by quarter by quarter. So it's all out there. So what I would say to you is go look at the S4s, and you can see quarter by quarter by quarter what the employment is.
But you've said, when you've been asked, that there was a net increase in employment. So what percentage of that was in the United States? I mean,
you know, if you looked at the way our markets grew, you would see that the overseas markets were growing faster than the U.S. markets. Of course, it was a very tough time in the U.S. So I was there from 1999 to 2005. So while the technology market grew slightly in that period, like 0.2%, the market in Africa was growing at 40%. The market in the Middle East was growing at 30%. And so obviously, as a percentage, we were increasing employment in the Middle East to respond to that burgeoning demand at a faster rate than we were increasing employment in the United States.
Let's call that outsourcing jobs, but
no, it's not outsourcing. Well, it's not outsourcing. Outsourcing jobs is when you take a job that is being done in the United States and you move it somewhere else, the same job. When you are entering a market in Saudi Arabia, for example, or Jordan, or South Africa, and you have customers in those countries who need service, who need to be sold to, you are adding Saudi Arabians, South Africans, Jordanians in those markets to serve those customers. And we did a great deal of hiring all around the world to serve growing markets. That is not outsourcing. Although, by the way, there are lots of people who purposefully confuse those terms to make a political point.
There's still, and we're not going to have time to debate it because we got to go, there's still the question of whether it's important for a CEO to fight to keep jobs here at home, even if you're trying to expand to other markets.
Absolutely, of course it is. And that's why, by the way, when people talk about real outsourcing, the biggest amount of outsourcing I did was from California to Texas.
Right.
It's time for monkey business. A Japanese zoo is apologizing because it named one of its baby monkeys Charlotte after the new royal baby. Apparently, some people in Japan thought that was offensive. Mark, on a scale of 1 to Godzilla, how bad should Japan feel about this?
Less than 1, as we say in Japanese, daijobu desu, no problem at all. Japanese can do what they want in this case. Want to thank our friends from the Des Moines Register, great hosts, great colleagues, and we look forward to continuing our strong coverage and partnership between Bloomberg Politics and the Des Moines Register. Nice, great journalists. Happy to be here.
Tomorrow, Michigan's one tough nerd, Governor Rick Snyder. And remember, we don't just thrive at 5, we're also great at 8. And you really ought to let us set the bar on your DVR. For now, as baby Charlotte says, cheerio. And as monkey Charlotte says, sayonara.